afternoon, everyone, or good morning to our left coast friends. Thank you all so much for joining the webinar today. We're going to get started here in just a minute. We're going to give maybe a couple more minutes for people to kind of filter in and make sure we've got everything taken care of. As a quick introduction, my name is Joey Kinney. I'm a virtual CFO with Summit Virtual CFO by Anders. That's a mouthful. I'm still getting used to saying that, but thank you all so much for joining us today. We are very excited to bring this webinar to you and talk about something that we know is impacting a lot of people in our organizations and with our client base, particularly in the digital space, as it comes to maybe some pipeline stuff getting a little bit weird, maybe some uncertainty there. And in those moments, it's really, really important to get some clarity around your team and your capacity and what they think we should do. Real quick, a couple of quick housekeeping items before we dive into the content. You'll see down there on the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A section. That's the best way to ask any questions that you may have during the webinar. If you're always welcome to reach out to those, and we'll be monitoring those during the webinar. And if we see some that we can answer real quickly, we'll answer those there. If not, we might bring it to the Q&A section at the very end of the show. One other item here is that the replay of this, slides, all of the stuff that you're going to see in this webinar will be sent to you by email tomorrow. So you'll always have the ability to go back and fast forward to your favorite part, or that one little knowledge bomb that our host Tom O'Neill is going to give you here in the next 40 minutes or so. And you can just have instant access to that and go back and access it anytime you want. So you'll see on the picture there, the godfathers of Summit CPA, Jody Grunin on your left, Adam Hale with the triceps on the right. They started Summit CPA as a traditional CPA firm in 2002. Pretty quickly, we started offering CFO and back office accounting services in 2004. In 2013, we pivoted to be a fully distributed firm, which we are very proud of still being a fully distributed firm. And we're also proud of that, we did that about 7 years before the rest of the world did in COVID. So very happy to be fully distributed. In 2022, we merged with Anders CPA and Advisors. That's our leadership team down there in that picture. And then last but not least, we are now Summit Virtual CFO by Anders, where we offer virtual CFO services and advisors as a hybrid work environment. We have about 400 or so employees, primarily based out of our St. Louis offices, and then the remainder of our team is fully remote and distributed across the United States. And I think we've got some members in Canada as well. So very proud of our fully distributed team and our ability to make the hybrid workforce.
Awesome. Thank you. Super excited to be here. Thank you so much, Joey, for including me. I've always been a big fan of Summit CPA. I think what you guys are doing is really great. These friends of mine who run digital agencies and consultancies that are using the virtual CFO services of Summit Virtual CFO by Anders really get a lot out of it, a lot of value. And I'm proud to be a part of that team, if even just as a guest on this webinar. So thank you so much. Today, we're going to talk about, kind of at a high level, why we should care about utilization, talking about the difference between billable capacity and a billable target, and how we can understand that billable capacity will drive a revenue capacity. Planning to target is going to kill your margin. We want you to plan to capacity, and I'll talk about how that works. And ultimately, the big takeaway that I hope that you all get from today's conversation is how you may be undervaluing the time of those brilliant people on your team. Almost everybody I know in this industry that is in the digital services industry, they really value the smart people that they've employed or asked to join their team to deliver great work. And that value of those people, I think, sometimes is not exactly represented. I can't say that word right now. Represented in the way that they sell and bill for their time. And we'll kind of talk about how that there's I think a core problem there. And so first of all, why should we care about utilization? Why should we care about billable capacity? Well, there's a bunch of reasons why, but today in the world that we live in, I think it's even more important than it ever has been to really understand what drives revenue and revenue capacity because the world's a little bit different right now. We recently surveyed about 100 different agencies to kind of ask, what are the biggest challenges or problems that you kind of see running your business? And overwhelmingly, the response was that is illustrated here was that people felt that they had very unpredictable revenue. That would be because maybe their pipeline isn't as predictable as it once was. It could be that their active projects, they didn't have the same confidence that they would extend or even just keep the active engagements alive as long as they could. People felt like problems around like the variance from utilization week over week, not staying as steady and straight as they had felt before. Also, there's a lot of feeling around margin compression. As the expectations of our workforce continue to go up, there's also some cost pressure. The cost pressure from our talent continues to go up. There's also some like price pressure from our customers that continues to come down, like kind of squeezing our margin. And then there's this new concern that's just really come to light over the last 3 years around burnout, around mental health, and what it means for our employees to invest so much of their lives into our businesses and how we can take responsibility for their well-being there. So these big concerns are what we're hearing in the market of why revenue capacity and utilization and being strategic about those two things is, in our opinion, more important than ever. And just to kind of level set, I really like this research that a company called SPI does annually. They put out a big benchmark survey with thousands of professional service organizations throughout the world. But this dimension of that benchmark is focused on North America and simplified a bit from their survey to just have 3 categories. I bring this data in front of you to just kind of tell a story that if you are feeling some of the pressures of operating a professional services business, a digital agency, you're likely not alone. By the statistics, many of us, 80% in this survey, are in the first category here, which we kind of call heroic, where most of us kind of start here, where we're really focused on being really good at the craft. If that's, design or brand or creative of some sort, like being really good at that craft is where we usually focus when we start a new company in this space. And over time, like the team grows and we, find new customers because we're doing great work and people want to be a part of that, right? But before we know it, we find ourselves feeling really reactive and opportunistic. And we don't have the processes and the tools to help us be very consistent. So we find ourselves very dependent on the heroic effort of our individuals on the team. And according to this survey, 80% of the companies find themselves kind of feeling that way, that they're good at the craft, but not so great at operations. And so only 17% feel that they've got that operations thing under control. In my actual experience, most people kind of feel like a foot in one of these camps, or both camps at the same time, almost stuck between the two. And, it shows in the numbers. The companies that are operational outperform their peers in heroic by a huge margin for utilization, contribution margin on projects, growth, et cetera. And so that feeling, though, of like reliance on heroic effort, I think is something that I remember feeling running my last company that was in the professional services space. And it's something that we built a tool at Parallax to try to resolve. I also think that partnering with a company like Summit by Anders, I think is going to help you kind of get squarely into that operational camp. But it starts about what you're measuring. If you're going to be measured and consistent, like let's make sure we're measuring the right things. And that's where I want to introduce this concept that I think also is one of the biggest problems in the digital services industry. A lot of us, again, we don't want to burn out our people. We want to make sure that they don't feel too overwhelmed, right? And so we kind of ask around to our friends, like, what is your expectation for billable utilization of your team? And I ask people this all the time, and they're usually saying, oh, it's probably like 80% or 85% is like what we expect for utilization. And then I ask the next question, okay, is that across the board? Everyone feels that way? And they're like, well, no, it kind of depends, like roughly 85%. And so as I peel back a few layers of the onion, they're usually going to explain to me that like their project managers are about 50, and then some design is about 60, and dev and QA we expect a little bit lower. And every agency or consultancy has different roles, but just in this example, I kind of went with like the standard web shop, distribution here as an example. But the reality is, like, when they start with that number of like 85% for the whole agency is what their expectation is, when I get them to start saying, well, what is the breakdown by role? If you kind of add it up, first of all, like that 85% across the board isn't true. We're actually expecting less, right? Because if some of those roles were expecting 50% and some of them are 85%, the sum cannot be 85%, right? So that's like one thing that I think is a pretty common problem when people aren't trying to be very accurate in the way that they estimate this or set expectations here. And so, okay, that's the goal. I get that. You're saying let's at a composite say that it's 70%, not 80%. We can agree that by some math, right? And they'll be like, okay, I'm following you. I can agree on math. I'm like, okay, cool. So then what do you typically book those people to? If you expect overall 70%, how many billable hours would you assign that team per week? And they say, well, yeah, we book them to 50% for PM, 20 hours. We book them to 24 for UX and 34 for dev and 34 for QA. I mean, I just told you, Tom, my goal is 70%, or, obviously I'm booking them to that. And I say, okay, well, what happens with the other hours, right? So like for a developer, for example, what are those other 6 hours for? And they say, oh, well, there's all this other stuff that we've got to do, right? Like, we have to go to the bathroom and eat lunch and have meetings and all the things. And so I'm like, okay, I believe you on that. I'm with you on that. But in the previous slide, you told me that your expectation overall was 85% for a developer. If you're only ever giving them 34 hours a week, and you would agree that not every week's going to be perfect, the best case scenario is that they're going to hit 85, right? So that can't be the goal, right? And they're like, what are you talking about? They kind of sometimes sails over their head. And I don't mean to be condescending on that, but it is kind of simple math. And I think we have to think about it like we would an airline. Like the Southwest Airlines is notorious for booking their flights much more than the capacity of the flight, because they know that not everyone's going to show up, right? And so if they book 120% of capacity of the flight, they know about 20% kind of fall out, and they know they're going to have a full flight, right? That's like the way that they roll. My point is, you're never going to hit that 85% target if you only ever book them to 34. Because on good weeks, they'll hit 34. And maybe a transition between projects, maybe something else came up, maybe they couldn't bill anything. There's going to be some weeks where they don't hit that full number, right? And maybe even there's one week that they work more than the 34 hours that you booked them. But for the majority of the time, it's going to, come out to an average that's under your goal, right? And so what we want to introduce is this idea that there's a difference between your billable capacity and your billable target. Before I move on, it looks like there's one question in the Q&A, and I wonder, Joey, is this kind of resonating? You got anything color to add here?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So the question is, are you saying that a more average agency blended company utilization is 70% and not the 85% that's talked about so much as standard? And the rub on that is that the client or the owner in this case has been trying to increase the billable hours for PM roles, and it's difficult to get them above 60. And I would say the answer to both those questions is yes. I've
right.
very rarely run across a PM role that you're able to get above 50%. And I also think it's important to note that the makeup of your team is going to be different too. If you've got a bunch of PMs and not a lot of producers at 85%, that's going to skew it lower. If you're in the more pyramid type structure that we try to coach our clients into, you're going to have a lot of producers at 85% and not as many people at that 50 to 60%. You're going to scale it that way. But yeah, I have 70% seems about right. And that might even be, depending on the size of the company, even a little bit aggressive from that perspective. And what I would imagine you're seeing here is if you're booking your revenue capacity, assuming everybody's going to get to 85%, you're never going to hit that revenue capacity goal because there's just too much administrative work to do on the back end.
And I think that I don't mean to completely disagree. I think you and I are aligned on about 80% of that, right? I
Yeah,
think
cool.
that, and that might be just we probably should have pre-gamed a little bit, so real time. But I think that the starting point is you made this point that, like, first of all, every agency or consultancy is different. So based on your distribution of headcount by role, you just have to acknowledge that you may have different expectations for each role. That's like baseline, right?
Yep.
That's the starting point. And, I'm happy to share this spreadsheet after, but you kind of could put in those roles and then put your head count for those roles, right? And then think about, like, what's your billable expectation for that role? Meaning that, like, what's your billable capacity for that role? Like you said, like, from a PM's perspective, I think it's normal to expect as a target that we actually realize 50%, but I don't think it's wrong to say, I will allow my team to give them billable work up to maybe even 85% for a PM. Meaning that if I've got the work to build, like, I would be able to schedule billable work up to something like 85% for a PM. And what might be different is with a developer, yes, I know there's things that are cost of doing business. We'll kind of get to that later, but my belief is that you could book them all the way up to 40 hours a week if you've got the work to do. But regardless of how you feel about that's for a different part of the discussion. The reality is, depending on how you set these things for a billable target based on role, that's going to impact what your composite or average utilization expectation is across the whole team. Because you can't say 85% for the whole group and expect 50% from one group and 85% from another. That's the biggest point that I'd like to make, right?
As the kids would say, that math ain't mathing, right?
That's right. That's right.
Well, I think it is a good point too there, where if as more clients are kind of moving into the staff aug type model or something like that, I would love for every single client to be able to have all of their team basically completely paid for in a billable perspective, right? Like, if you can schedule your engagements with your clients where, that PM role is completely covered by the fee to where they're effectively completely utilized from your perspective, that's the dream, right?
Well, let's talk about that quick. So this is an important part of the conversation, right? So I think that what you just kind of nailed, that I think is a perfect tee up for this next part of the talk, is that billable capacity is what's driving our revenue capacity, right? So again, the first point I want to make is that let's decouple the goal from our capacity. The goal should be like less capacity, right? If we have a capacity of 100 hours, we're never going to hit 100 hours every week. So let's set the goal slightly lower than that, knowing that there's some ebb and flow. So when I ask you in the future, what is your billable capacity, you should say, 100 hours a week. And when I say, what's your billable target, you might say 90 hours a week or 80 hours a week, right? Like, thinking about those two things different is like a big point that I want to make, because that capacity, less like the variance between capacity and actual, is what's going to drive that billable capacity. And so let's kind of skip ahead and kind of talk about that. There is a conversation I have with every agency I meet where I say, let's do a little math to try to make sense of this stuff, right? So I'll say, hey, how many billable employees or contractors do you have on a regular basis? And then they may say, I don't know, like 33. I'm like, okay, great. Well, then what's your average bill rate? And they'll say 185. And then I'll ask, okay, cool. What's your average billable utilization annually? And, they'll like proudly say what their capacity target is. And they'll say 85%. I'm like, so on average, every quarter you're doing 85%. They're like, well, it's different for every role, whatever. So that I'm like, all right, let's take a pause there. But I can like plug that into like a simple calculator and come up with like, here's what I would expect your revenue capacity to be then, right? And so to kind of like do that real time for you, let's have that little discussion, right? So here's my spreadsheet. I said 33, 185. They told me 85, and I said, well, and I'll usually kind of ground it in the floor, and I'll say, I'll put 65 in there without telling them. And I'll say, okay, cool. So based on what you're saying, then if it's 33, 185, and 65% or 85%, I'm guessing that your revenue would be anywhere between, I don't know, 7 million, and then I'll change this to 85 and say 9 million. And like clockwork, every single time the agency owner or operator will say, no, closer to the low end. And I'm like, so closer to like what, 6.5 million or something like that? And she'll say, yeah, that sounds about right. And I'll be like, okay, one of these things isn't correct. If you're telling me that you do all of these other numbers, right? You have 33 people, 185, 85% utilization. That just can't be true. Like the math doesn't add up. That math isn't math enough, Joey would say, right? And so what this little calculator showing us is that either I'm trying to get it to fit in the whole screen. Either you have fewer people. So I'm like, well, maybe are a lot of those contractors, because I don't know, when my agency was smaller, when we were like 50 people, I'd always say that we're 60. And when we were 300, I used to say we were 350. I kind of like exaggerate a little bit based on the, contractors or whatever. So I'll ask you, like, when you said 33, does that include your contractors and stuff too? Like, would you say it's a little bit lower, like maybe closer to 23? And they're like, no, it's closer to 25. Eventually I kind of like walk down this, like, one of these things doesn't belong row here. And we'll come to like agree that their actual utilization is probably closer to 65, right? Because that maths a little bit better, The idea is that like people misunderstand like how important that utilization number is when you're thinking about like maximizing the revenue capacity of your team. Because the truth is, for that 6.5 million, if I truly am at 85%, then I truly could do that with 23 people. That's doable. And I can do that without burning out my team. That's what we're going to talk about today. Because if you can all agree that this math adds up, that we've got like accounted for holidays, PTO, all those sorts of things in these utilization numbers. If you have 23 people at 185 doing 85% utilization on average over the year, you absolutely can do $6.5 million. But if you're telling me that the max you can like staff them to, that you can plan their capacity to, is something more like 70, there's no way in heck you're going to do $6.5 million for those 23 people, right? That's why you need the 33 people to get closer, if that makes sense, right? And that then becomes a bit of a circular answer, because as you increase your headcount, you're now having to increase your, what we would call your fixed cost, your overhead cost to support that high of a team, which now means the pressure on your revenue capacity is even higher, because now you have a bigger fixed cost you got to cover every month. 100%, right? And that's the story we're telling here, right? Like, is if you're just not actually doing the math and understanding that math, it's really easy for you to kind of slide into that I think misset expectation, right? And so like kind of walking through that with us and kind of a few slides that walk through that, it's really about X people at X rate and Z utilization, right? Like this math is very simple in the business model. It really is. The hard part is, as you guys pointed out, how do I get our customers to pay more for the PM time? How do I get our customers to pay more for those developers' time? If we're going to expect higher than 85% utilization, or even at 85% utilization, how do I get our customers to pay that, right? We've done this in my spreadsheet, so I'll skip it. I think in my opinion, the way that you do it is you raise your billable capacity expectation, meaning that you stop undervaluing the time that your people are spending at work. And the biggest pushback I get on that is like, how do I do that? Because my customers don't want to pay for all that PM time. My customers like don't expect to pay for the time that my developers or designers are in their HR meetings or in their team one-on-ones or the whatever, the things that I think a lot of us kind of call the cost of doing business. And for a long time, I felt the same way. I think I missed something in my setup, and I keep thinking I should probably let you guys know it. Prior to the company that I'm running now, Parallax, I spent 14 years building a professional service organization called Nerdery, and we grew to 500 people and 85 million in sales. And so I've been through a lot of this journey personally. And over the last 4 years of running this new business, Parallax, and helping a lot of agencies and consultancies, I've learned a lot about how other people have solved this problem or how other people like feel about this problem. And so again, one of the biggest issues that I see in the industry is that we set our targets for billable capacity too low. I would like to see more companies say, I expect 40 hours of billable work from most of my team. And again, the pushback I'm getting on that is, well, what about all the other things? What about the cost of doing business? Like, after all, like the team has to eat, right? We can't possibly ask the clients to pay for lunch, right? And it's not just lunch, of course, it's everything that goes along with the care and feeding of our team. There's a lot of things that we have to do to develop our team, to coach our team, to have opportunities for them to work towards advancement, to collaborate with their peers. Yeah, there's a lot of things that we have to do to care and feed for our people, right? And the question is, who's responsible for that cost? I agree that we have to consider that, but my question is, who's responsible? And when we were a small company, 50 people, we felt wholly responsible for that. We said, we cannot possibly bill our customers for the time that they're meeting with their HR people, right? Or that sort of thing. But as I grew the company and as we kind of learned what our peers in the industry were doing, we found out that the real cost of doing business is something that we should share with our customers, that we should actually give our customers the responsibility for that cost. If you look at some of the best digital consultancies in the world, like ThoughtWorks, Deloitte Digital, Slalom, they're not billing out their consultants at 32 hours a week. They're billing their consultants out at half or quarter or full time. You're either paying 40 hours a week, 20 hours a week, or 10 hours a week for any consultant. They're billing their people out as a fractional resource, very similar to the way that Summit does it, right? It's a best-in-class way of positioning the value of your product. Now, this doesn't work if you've spread your people thin across 7 or 8 or 9 different projects that change from week to week. But if you can start to plan your projects in a way that's more thoughtful and proactive, if you can realize some of the benefit of scale that you should have when your team reaches 15 or 20 or 30 people, you should start to build these project plans based on a duration that the people are working on the project. Sure, there's going to be all kinds of different ways we can break down the work as we do it. We're going to use task management systems and do either agile or waterfall or some methodology for breaking down that work. But instead of trying to do your resource planning and your billing based on that work breakdown, think about it as these individuals planned over time. And when it comes to the cost of doing business, I argue it is the customer's responsibility for that cost. After all, if the customer decided not to hire you, but instead hire a small team of digital strategists or a team of web developers, they'd be responsible for hiring, developing, retaining, all of the stuff that you're doing that's a cost of doing business for this team, right? And so by hiring you guys, not only are they having us who are experts at that care and feeding, experts at building those teams, they're also enjoying the methodology that we teach these teams to work together on. They're also enjoying the benefit of having their almost dedicated team work in concert or alongside a bunch of other people who are working on similar problems for different companies that they're learning from. And those interactions that happen that might take a half hour here or an hour there throughout a week that you might not have billed for in the past, even if it's over lunch or at the water cooler or on Slack, the customers are benefiting from that interchange, right? The customers are benefiting from you being really good at engaging these people on the kind of problems that customer is trying to solve. The customer is not good at hiring their own people for this stuff. They're not, using a methodology that works that they've trained these people to employ. That's why ThoughtWorks and Deloitte Digital and Slalom and all those guys, they bill out their people based on a fraction of a week, not the micro hour that you worked on this tiny little task. And so it's really about a mindset shift about how you sell and how you value the work.
Yeah, we used to have a saying, but a little preface here. Before I started working with digital agencies, I worked in the construction space. And we used to have a saying in construction, you're not paying the plumber for banging on the pipe, you're paying the plumber for knowing where to bang on the pipe. And that's something that we talk a lot about with our clients in terms of explaining where the value is. A lot of times your resources that aren't fully utilized, think about like your middle management people, your PMs, or maybe like a senior type person on your team who's responsible for disseminating information and workflow, but also knowledge down to lower staff members. Like, that person is adding a ton of value to the process and adding a ton of value to the team. And if you're sitting there saying, well, it was just an internal meeting, like, no, knowledge was being disseminated, and this role would not be able to happen without that knowledge being disseminated down to the groups that are maybe doing the production work.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think that's this collective expertise, the collective methodology. There's been some great questions here. If you don't mind, I'll just kind of like, I'll respond to a couple of them at once with one response. I think the big question that people are asking here in the Q&A is really related to like, how do we get the customer to come on board with this idea that we're selling like duration-based engagements over like more like fixed scope, task-oriented engagements. And one of the questions was, the pitfall from sticking to planned capacity is the client delay, that they'll say, oh, we need to get back to you in a few weeks after some design review. Another one was, how do we get the customers to understand the value of project management time when many of our customers are saying they don't want to invest in project management time? It's 100% in sales and marketing. It's 100% in positioning. I run a product company now, and when I was running Nerdery, I'd always say, man, I wish it was a product company. It'd be so much easier because we'd have recurring revenue and blah, blah, blah. The grass is always greener. Now that I'm running a product company, I look back at my time running a services business and I'm like, boy, I miss some of the best parts about running a consulting firm or an agency. It's because every single time you go to market, it's an opportunity to reinvent yourself. You can take what you've learned from the past 6 months and apply it to the way that you represent yourself to the market and the way that you resell or sell or position your services, right? And so like the big thing here is that I hear all the time, I've heard probably 100 times in the last 6 months, people saying that our customers don't want to pay for PM time in some way, shape, or form. And I'm sorry to say, but that is not a true statement. Your customer doesn't want to pay for the PM time the way that you've positioned the value. Your customer doesn't see that you value your project manager's time enough to help them see how it's going to make them and their project more successful. If you're unable to be confident in positioning the value of that project manager's work, that has nothing to do with your customer. That is 100% on you. And so you need to go back and understand like what the value proposition to the customer, not to the agency, does that project manager bring? I think part of the issue, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was gonna say that's really easy for us to say, and it's a lot tougher to do in reality. And one of the strategies I've seen a lot of clients employ is, and it's a similar one to what we do in our virtual CFO services, because we have a very robust support team that we've kind of baked into the price of our services. And when asked the question, well, what's the value of that? It's like, well, someone has to do it, and you can either do it or you can let us do it. And you should probably let us do it because we specialize in this. We do this all the time. We're going to be able to get done in 2 hours what's going to take you 5.
And I think you just kind of like set me up nicely to transition to that second question of like the biggest problem to sticking to planned capacity is client delays. And so like if you play your cards right in this, you can solve both of those problems with better positioning. Like what is the value of a project manager to a project if run correctly? In my mind, there's all kinds of pitfalls that we could avoid, one of them being client delays, if we have better, more proactive project management. But if a project manager is supposed to split her time between 20 projects with 2 hours a week, because that's the way that our customers are willing to pay for it, how is she ever going to be proactive to help us avoid or overcome these potential pitfalls that she should be able to see out in the future? There's absolutely no time there's no chance that she could possibly be that proactive or be good at coaching the client at staying ahead of these problems, right? So that client delay, that could have been avoided with a great project plan and a very proactive project manager who's helping the customer stay ahead of those delays and warning them of the problems related to it, right? And so it can't be positioned, though, as a benefit for the agency to have a project manager. Otherwise, it should be your cost. It should be a benefit to the customer. So what I've been very successful with a whole bunch of different digital agencies and consultancies doing and repositioning project management specifically in a way that's more valuable is to like have a little working session between a trusted client partner that you would trust to help you understand this value proposition, the people on your team delivering the work and the people kind of selling the work, and try to break that down. Like, don't think about the value proposition from the agency's perspective, but from the customer's perspective. Figure out how to create that as a differentiating value between you and the other consulting firms or agencies that you're competing with, because you have that. Maybe you got to call it something different. Like I've seen people call it like digital strategy or like, account leadership or whatever. Maybe you need to repackage it for you to feel more comfortable and confident. But we all know that when there's a deficit in good project management that can be proactive rather than reactive, it leads to a lot of challenges in the projects, right? And so you just got to figure out how to sell that to the customer, right?
Well, and for those on the call who've worked with someone on our team before or have been clients of Summit, like that is the best representation of that is our onboarding process, where we do. I think we've invested more headcount and resources in refining our onboarding process to do exactly what you're saying. We lead with very, very strong project management up front, and we say, hey, you're gonna pay a little bit more up front because we're investing in all of these people to help define processes and procedures and get ahead of those client delays, because we struggle with client delays too. That's probably our biggest challenge in getting somebody up and running in our systems, is just the delay in getting stuff handled. But we've tried to overcome that through more investment in project managers, more investment in process and procedure, and then following those best practices as best we can with every client.
Love it. Love it. There's a couple of other great questions on here. Kate asked, our 50-50 split between retainer and more project-oriented work. I would not try to solve the retainer business with this model. We could do another talk on where I think best practices are for retainers. This is much more oriented around project stuff. I think I will try to inspire you, though, to try to make sure that you're treating those two work streams and revenue streams very different. You should not be using the same methodologies for those two things. Retainers, I think, are typically meant to be more of like a managed service, where this kind of work, where it's more project-oriented work, you want to think of more as a dedicated team, and those things are different, right? So let's separate those. And then I think it's maybe pronounced, Ian asked about developers, 2 projects, 50-50 allocation. You nailed it. They bill 20 hours a week, and there's the cost of doing business in there, right? They still have to go to the bathroom and eat lunch and go to team meetings and all that stuff, but we've set expectation during the sales process that you're going to get billed out at 20 hours a week. We're not going in for the nuance of like they have a team meeting. Like, it just doesn't matter. I promise you, it all works out in the wash. They're certainly still crunching those numbers on that algorithm as they're eating lunch, right? But the one exception on that rule is vacation and PTO. I think what I think is best practice is to not bill the customer for the vacation and the PTO. That's my opinion. People do it both ways, but that's my opinion.
I think that's probably the easier one to sell to the client, is like, hey, we'll be responsible for those types of things. And maybe I could see the argument too for some culture time, like if you're wanting to have various things that, maybe you're not as client related and more towards culture, maybe backing those out would be okay. But
well, you've obviously maybe set up the next slide on my deck.
It's like we planned this.
I think that like this really important thing is that we need to make sure that we are valuing our time. I think when I have this conversation with people, and I say, come on, like, seriously, what is that extra 6 hours? Like, you say you're only going to ever book anyone to 34 hours a week, and that is like a cultural thing. Like, we cannot do that, Tom, because if we did that, I'd be telling my team that I don't value other stuff that they'd be spending their time on outside of client work. I think the reality is you just have to say that on most weeks that we have to put a priority on billable work, because the truth is, let's think about it and let's break it down. I've had so many people tell me that, Tom, I want to spend about 2 hours a week for like team building type stuff and 2 hours a week for like management stuff. And then 4 hours a week or maybe or whatever for like, they can spend whatever they want on that time for like personal professional development. And I'd say, okay, I mean, but where's your training program? Where are the tools and the support that they're going to get to better utilize that 6 hours on a weekly basis? And show me one person on your team who's maximized the value out of those 6 hours week in, week out for even half of the weeks of the 52-week year. Show me one person who's got 26 weeks worth of effort or input into those 6 hours that made them a better developer, designer, or whatever. And the truth is, like, not very often can they show me a program that's consistently working. But I said, what if you said, okay, fine, we're going to expect people to bill most weeks at 40 hours. And yeah, sure, you still have your team meetings and whatever, but we're going to bill for 40 of the hours. We're not going to reserve 6 hours for like the ambiguous, like, culture time. Like, what does that turn into if we save that up, if we spend that time on billable work instead of investing it in nothing? On 52 weeks at $185 an hour, that's $60,000. You know, even if you put a couple of extra weeks in there, that's $55,000. How could you better invest that money into your team, into that one individual? Imagine if you said, we're going to give you a whole week off paid, and you have a budget of $10,000 to go to any conference or training or whatever of your choice for that week. If you were a developer or designer, what would you pick? An ambiguous 4 to 6 hours a week that really you end up using on time that you wouldn't put on a ticket because you don't want to get yelled at for going over budget, you know? Or
God, I felt that in my soul.
You know, or like, would you love to say, tell your spouse, your loved ones, I'm going to California for a boot camp for a month that my company's paying for? Or a week, sorry, a month is too much, but a week is doable. So the idea is, like, do we really value our people's time? Do we value the project manager's time? I think if you've been unable to position the value of your project manager's time to your customer to the point where they'll pay for it, I question how much you value it. Mm-hmm. On the surface, you might say that you value it, and you might feel some empathy for it, but if you can't articulate the value in a way that your customer will pay for it, I challenge you on that. If you say you value your people's time and you're going to give them an extra 6 weeks to do some ambiguous thing outside of billing your clients, how often are you holding yourself accountable to getting value out of those extra 4 to 6 hours for those people? I'll challenge you on that. And then look to our peers in the industry, again, ThoughtWorks and Deloitte Digital and Slalom and all these companies who have kind of proven the business model, and look to how they're selling, positioning, and recognizing revenue on their time. And so it starts there. It starts with how you value the time. Then you can help your customers see the value of that time in that way. And then, frankly, just, you know, starting to book them to the full 40, you know, instead of only booking them to 32. Like, that's like a pretty tactical end of the day thing that we need to try to do.
Well, I love your example there of the airplane, because it's, you know, it's one of those things where we see that happen. And when we do see the airplane accidentally overbook its flight, it seems like, oh my God, this is awful. This is the worst. This happens all the time. And then you think about, like, it happens maybe like once or twice a week, and there's 40,000 flights in a week. And so the percentage where that happens is actually pretty small. It's just very, very visible.
Yeah.
So there's a reason those larger companies are doing that. It's because they know statistically it works out for them. I've got a couple of questions to ask you that have just kind of popped into my head during this conversation. We've got about 10-ish minutes left or so on the webinar. So for the attendees out there, if you have any other questions that you'd love us to answer, shoot them over into the Q&A session. Otherwise, I'll get started on my questions. One of the trends that I've seen with some of our clients, and again, it goes back to some of the larger macro trends we've seen with staffing and burnout. We've seen a lot of shifts and trends towards 4-hour work weeks and kind of minimized minimize time from that perspective. How would you adjust this program from a 40-hour week down to like a 36 or a 32-hour week? Is it just a simple matter of scaling it back, or are there additional considerations we need to be thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it will scale back to 36-hour work week. I think that if you don't mind, I have like another deck that I want to show you a slide from.
I'd love to see
I think that this is I think that the reality is that I guess I challenge the premise that putting a 36-hour target week versus a 40-hour target week is actually the problem. So let me just show you one slide, I think, that kind of illustrates the problem that I see better. Let's see here. Can you guys still see my screen now with this awesome UX lady, or do I have to reshare? I think I have to reshare, don't I?
Yeah, we see just the three of us, I suppose. Yep, there it is.
Okay, so you know, I hear this all the time, right? I'll go to conferences and speak with peer groups, and people are saying, what do I need to do to like get my people from saying they're burned out and they're going to quit? And you know, the workforce today is just different than it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, right? And I think that when I hear that from old people, and I'll put myself in the old person category, I think that they're out of touch, that they're thinking that these younger people, these 30-somethings or 20-somethings, are lazy and they only want to work, you know, 30 hours a week. I just think they're wrong about that. Maybe there are some people like that. Maybe. I don't think so. I don't think the mental health issue that we're dealing with it when it comes to burnout in an organization like this and these digital agencies has as much to do with the number of hours they're expected to put in a work week is the number of expectations that they're meant to deal with distributed across way too many stakeholders and customers. I think most digital agencies and digital consultancies, again, they start from that point of an entrepreneurial framework where there's 4 or 5 people on the team and they're trying to figure out how to do as many projects as they can at once. And so we have a natural tendency in that mode to break down those projects into smaller bits that we can kind of work on in parallel across maybe 5 projects with 3 people. That's like the natural entrepreneurial way, but it's not efficient. It's not efficient at all. You have situations like this one where this poor woman who's illustrated here, she's stretched across 6 projects with 6 different project managers, each trying to like orchestrate their project but task basis, week over week, day over day. And well, she signed up to be a user experience designer on our team. She's spending half of her darn day doing triage across these different tickets, across these different projects that she's put on. And so she's doing ticket number 1 on Monday, and it's only supposed to be a half hour. And she's like, went over by 15 minutes. She doesn't know where to put her time. So she just doesn't bill it at all. And then she goes into the next one, and maybe it's like a hour and a half in, and you know, she gets pulled in a different direction. She doesn't know where to put her time, right? She has all of this issue around context switching. She is meant to try to figure out the sequence in which she should deliver across 4 different projects to make sure that she's making all of those project managers' expectations. It's insane. These leaders who I meet with are saying, hey, Tom, like my team is all saying they're burned out, but they're not billing more than 40 hours a week. They're not recording more than 40 hours a week. Why are they saying they're burned out? I'm like, well, A, they're probably not recording all the time that they've actually worked because they don't know what.
100%.
You know, B, you know, by the end of the week, it's not burnout because they worked 80 hours. It's burnout because they're not sure if they're providing value. They spent the first 3 days of the week focused on project A, where they knew that the project manager was kind of on their case. And meanwhile, they're kind of ducking so that project manager B and C doesn't get their attention because they know that they're kind of, you know, letting their tasks and priorities slip a little bit to focus on this other one. This shouldn't be part of her job. She's a creative, she's a craftsperson. So how are you setting her up so that she's not stuck in this triage environment every single day? Well, if you don't value her time and you're trying to micromanage her half-hour blocks because you don't trust her to like behave like a professional, it's going to feel like this to her. It's going to cost you in utilization. It's going to cost you in margin. It's going to cost you in fewer projects delivered on time and fewer referenceable customers. Because guess what? When she's dodging, you know, project manager X and, you know, trying to serve project manager Y, the expectations across the or agency are being mismanaged. And most importantly, in this world today where we are finally starting to realize how important mental health is, why is your high value talent asking, why am I working this hard and not feeling the value of our work? It's because they're too fragmented in most cases. So I guess my argument is that it isn't the 36-hour week that's going to solve this problem. It's just going to condense this chaos into 4 fewer hours.
So it's a structural issue more so than a volume issue.
Yep. And it starts with planning. We have to plan for people to be more evenly distributed across these workloads. We have to acknowledge that a small project and a medium project, the amount of time that some of these roles should spend on these projects based on the project size isn't a linear scale. I see all too often like people putting together these proposal templates where they add up all like the deliverable hours for like a website or whatever. And at the bottom, they put like 10% per PM and 10% for QA. But we all know that the truth is, if it's a $30,000 website over 6 weeks or a $300,000 website over 12 weeks, in some cases, that $30,000 website takes more PM time because those smaller customers are a little bit more, they need a little bit more help than some of the bigger customers. Like it is not a linear scale. You cannot expect the same distribution of project management, for example, to scale with a project based on deliverable. You have to scope every one of these roles as how are they going to participate in the methodology at which we deliver the work, right? It's not just a function of how many hours you think it's going to take to do that one design. It has to be, how does that fit into the greater picture of how we deliver the work? What does the methodology look like over time? And how much of what fraction of a week could the people that are involved in that methodology, what is the minimum fraction that they could be applied to that project and have an effective and efficient impact on the project?
Well, and to circle it back too, if you can then position that as a value-added proposition to the customer, now you've figured out how to boost the utilization of your project managers.
You got it, Joey. 100%.
We've got one last question here in the chat, and then we'll be pretty much at time. The question is, how do you manage PTO taken and hours owed to the client? Are you still tracking time and adjusting billing weekly?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's my recommendation. I've seen it done a bunch of ways. Some people sell these managed teams as almost like a retainer where there's a monthly or biweekly fee. My personal recommendation, I think the customers feel more comfortable with, if like you're still billing for the time worked, but you don't expect a time entry for an individual to be super granular, like an hour. You're kind of doing half, quarter, full week, full days, right? And so if there's a couple of PTO days in there, you just don't bill for it, right? And unless, of course, you wanted to plan for that PTO in advance and have
some coverage kind of backfill. And
which is a good way to do that too. But ultimately, it is as long as you're kind of thinking of it in half day increments, that's how I'd think about it, and don't bill for PTO or holidays, but don't expect execution and work on those days either. So plan your backlog accordingly.
Plan your deliverables accordingly to factor that in.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, Tom, this has been a blast. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Real quick, how can folks get a hold of you if they have questions about you, about Parallax, if they want to learn a little bit more about everything that we've talked about today? What's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Thank you so much for asking. I think it looks like we're going to post some of this on YouTube. I want to make sure that we kind of put up your information too, but you can learn more about Parallax. Our product is a resource planning and project accounting system that helps do like proactive forecasting, helps do kind of resource planning in this strategy. You can learn about us at getparallax.com. And I'm always willing to talk shop. If anyone has any follow-up questions here, happy to answer them. You can email me at tom@getparallax.com. And I don't know, Joey, one of our teams could probably make this spreadsheet available for download. It's a pretty fun tool where you can kind of like calculate what your revenue capacity is based on what your billable expectations are. So if anyone wants a copy of that, we'll try to figure out how to make it available. And always I'm happy to kind of walk you through it too. So.
Perfect. And I love that. That's a very similar methodology to what we use in our onboarding. So I'm like, yep,
Perfect.
Please. Thank you. All of this.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. As we mentioned, email, you'll get an email in the next, I think, hopefully tomorrow, maybe in the next couple of days, with the slide deck as well as the video recording of this. And then if we can figure out how to share that spreadsheet with some folks, we might see if we can include that in that email as well. That way, everyone's got access to the resources.
I'm pretty sure our marketing teams that are much smarter than you and I, Joey, will figure that out for us, won't they?
I sure hope so. You don't want me doing marketing. There's a reason I do the numbers.
Yeah, right on. All right, you guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate y'all.